Permissions. A permission is a setting that's defined to control access to a resource. In our videos you've seen various permissions, but now it's time to take a closer look at how an administrator can use permissions to improve security in your network. Now most people generally think about folders or files when the subject of permissions comes up, but of course there are many more things than just folders or files to think about. System services, registry keys, remote access, just to name a few, all use permissions as a method of controlling access. Now the most common of course are files and folders, so let's take a look at sharing folders and the permissions associated with those folders first. So to create a new shared folder we first need a folder to share. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on the desktop and I'm going to create a new folder. And now we need to give our folder a name, and I'm just going to call this one Data. I'll just move this over here. And now we'll right click on our folder and we'll select Sharing and Security. Now alternatively you can actually right click on our folder and select Properties, and that'll take you to roughly the same spot, and then it'll take you to the General tab, so at that point just click on the Sharing tab and you'll be where we are now. Now you'll probably notice that everything here is greyed out with the exception of these two buttons. So the first thing we need to do is to enable sharing of this folder by clicking on Share this folder. Now by default the name of the folder will become the name of the share. Now of course we can change this if we wish, but I'm going to leave this as Data. Oh, and a little gotcha here is, let's say we're a bit quick off the mark and didn't realise that we'd made a spelling mistake, and let's say we'd called this share Data 1 and then we'd clicked on OK. And what you'll notice if we go back into our sharing and security is that we can no longer actually change the name of our share. So what we need to do at that point is choose Do Not Share This Folder, click Apply, go back to Share This Folder, and now we can return to our original name or change it to whatever we wish. Now using our name of Data we'll actually create a share that is visible in our browse list. But if you'd prefer to create a hidden share, then you can add the $ to the end of the share, and then you won't see this share in browse list, or if you're connecting remotely. But you will still see the share if you open up and view shares via the Computer Management MMC. Now the next thing we can do is we can add a description if we like, and then we can set a maximum user limit. Now it does default to maximum allowed, but you can change that by clicking on Allow this number of users and then putting in a value here in this box. So assuming we left this setting as it is, we would only have 10 simultaneous users who can connect to this share at any one time. Now this is often overlooked, but this can provide a good method of enforcing licensing. We'll assume for a moment that you have an application that lives in this shared folder that's licensed for 50 users only. So we could simply enter in 50 here, and then we'd be sure that we could only have 50 concurrent connections. Okay, now the next button we have here is the Permissions button, and if we click on this button it will bring up the permissions for the shared folder. Now when we talk about permissions we're generally referring to one of two types of permissions: share permissions or file permissions. Now this button here refers to share permissions. So what's the difference between share and file permissions? Well, share permissions are applied every time a user accesses a file or folder across the network, but they're not applied when a user accesses a file or folder whilst they're logged on locally to the computer, such as what we are now. Now file or NTFS permissions on the other hand are applied all the time, regardless of where you're accessing the file or folder from. However, just to confuse you a little, if you happen to be accessing a file across the network, then both share and file permissions apply. Now what happens in this situation is the share and file permissions are compared, and then the most restrictive permission is applied, but we'll talk a little bit about this in a moment. Now by default the new share permissions are set to allow the Everyone group read access. Now simply put, this means that everyone that connects to this share as it stands right now will be able to view files contained in this folder, but they will not be able to save, delete or modify them in any way. Now when we talk about these share permissions, keep in the back of your mind that share permissions represent the maximum amount of access that you can expect to get inside our share. So to clarify this, what I mean is, if your access to the share is set to read, then no matter what permissions you have on the inside, read is the best you can ever hope to get. So if you have the change permission on the share, yet there's another folder inside this one that gives you full control, your effective maximum permission for the share and all of its contents becomes change. Okay, we've got three permissions here. As you can see, we have full control, change and read. Now as obvious as it sounds, full control means you have full control. With this permission you can perform any and all functions on file and folders within the share. The change permission gives you the ability to read, execute, modify and delete files and folders inside our share. And finally, read means you can read and execute files and folders, but you cannot modify or delete anything or add any new files to the share. Now also note that the Everyone group is the only group listed by default, and we don't see the administrator listed anywhere. Now that's okay because the administrator has full control by default. But if you do want to provide full control to your remote administrators, you'll need to explicitly add those permissions to the share. Okay, so if we want to add a new user or group to our share permissions, we can simply click on the Add button. Now at this point you can either type in the name of the user or group and then click on OK, or you can browse for a user or group by clicking on the Advanced button and then choosing Find Now. Now we just simply have to locate the user or group we wish to add, and then we'll click OK and OK again. Now of course you can also add multiples in at a time. If we go back and click on Add, Advanced, Find Now, we could choose a whole bunch of different people here as well. I've got a user account down here, XP User 1, and we'll click on OK, and you'll notice we now have a group here and a user. We'll click OK again, and we can see all of our users and groups here listed under the user or group names. Now by default, our new user that we just added only has read permission. Now our XP User 1 is a user, so they're assigned the rights of the Everyone group. Now we've just explicitly added in XP User 1's account, and of course that also defaults to read. So in effect, this has done absolutely nothing to improve XP User 1's abilities to do anything but read items in our share. So if we want XP User 1 to be able to modify files and folders within this share, we could simply add change to XP User 1's permissions and then click on OK. Now XP1 has read assigned to him as part of his membership in the Everyone group, and he has change assigned to his account directly. So which permission wins? Well, when dealing with multiple permissions like this, where a user may be assigned different permissions by being a member of multiple groups, we can simply add all of XP User 1's permissions together, and then the best permission wins. In this case, change is better than read, so as far as XP1's permissions goes, he gets change. Now one thing that we didn't look at with regards to the permissions is the effect of the deny column. Now you have to be careful with deny entries, as they're not as straightforward as they might appear. A deny entry will override an allow. So if we go back to our XP User 1, we see he has change and he has read. Now suppose that XP User 1 was a member of a group called Managers. Now if we decided that Managers are allowed to read the contents of our data share, we can assign the Managers group read. But what about the Everyone group? Well, the first reaction might be to click the deny box to deny everyone else access. But who is part of the Everyone group? Everyone, including Managers. Now this means that the share permissions are calculated together, and even though the Managers group has read access, it's overridden by the deny permission, and then the Managers will be denied access. So in this situation, the solution would be to remove the Everyone group by highlighting Everyone and then choosing Remove, and at that point our Managers would then have read access. Now if for some reason you actually do want to deny access to certain people or groups, you can use deny to do it. Just be careful that users or groups that are allowed to access the share are not members of a group that you're denying access to. If in doubt, it's best to either explicitly list the users separately, then deny them, or place them into a new group and then deny that group access, or simply leave them out altogether and remove the Everyone group as we just did. Now deny entries don't only allow or deny complete access. Consider a situation where your account has full control on the share, but you also belong to a group that has the change permission on this share, and it's set to deny. Now even though you have full access on one hand, on the other, the deny change has just taken away your ability to modify, create or delete files. So as a result of this, your effective permission now becomes read only. So the rule here is be very careful with deny entries. Oh, I guess as a side note, if a user here, we'll take our XP User 1, has neither any allow or any deny permissions, then they're automatically denied too as a result. Okay, we've just had a good look here at share permissions, so let's move on and we'll discuss file and folder permissions. Now to look at file or folder permissions, or NTFS permissions as they're better known, we can simply right click on our folder, we'll select Properties, and we'll come over here to our Security tab. Now by default on a new folder we have 6 sets of permissions here at the bottom, plus a special entry here called Special Permissions, which we'll discuss later. Now hidden from view from this window are actually 13 other permissions that you also need to be aware of. Well, truth be told, there's actually 14 in the list, but the first one is full control, and that's just the equivalent of having all the other 13 permissions, so we don't include that one. Okay, here we see a list of all of the NTFS permissions. Now the best way to read this table is to read down the columns. So if we take our fourth column, the read and execute column, a user or group that's been assigned the read and execute permission for a file or folder then has the following permissions. They can traverse folders or execute files. They can also list folder contents, meaning they can browse the contents of the folder, and read data, which means they can view the file contents. They can also read the attributes of a file or folder, and these are things like viewing the archive bit and read-only hidden or system files. Now they can also read extended attributes, and these are things like the subject, author, and copyright information on documents. Finally, the read and execute permission gives you read permissions. Now this here is the ability to display the permissions of the file or folder on the security tab to see who has access. So if we compare this read and execute permission to the full control permission, for example, you can see that the full control permission has every permission available and thus has no restrictions on what they can do. Now you might have already noticed that some of these permissions in the far left hand column have 2 permissions. Now the reason for this is that NTFS permissions apply to both files and folders. So if we can consider the top example, traverse folder and execute file, you can't traverse through a file to get to another file, and you can't execute folders. So basically what happens here is when you attempt to open a file or a folder, the NTFS permission takes a look at the object to see whether it's a file or a folder. If it's a folder, the traverse folder permission is applied, and if it's a file, the execute file permission is applied. Now a little earlier I mentioned this special permissions here, and I said I'd come back to this topic, so here we are. Special permissions are simply the term used for custom permissions. So let's assume that a user has read and execute permissions on this file or folder, but we want them to be able to change extended attributes on files. Well, we could assign them the write, modify or full control permissions, and they'd be able to do this, but we're giving them way too much access to perform one task. The solution is hidden here under this advanced button. So to illustrate this further, what we'll do is we'll create a new folder, and we'll right click, we'll select properties, then we'll go to our security tab, and in here we'll add a new user. We'll add in XP user 1, and we'll click OK and OK again. Now notice that with our new folder for XP user 1, the default is for XP user 1 to have read and execute, list folder contents and read permissions. Now if we come over here and click on the advanced button, we can see XP user 1 account listed here with the read and execute permission. So let's click on edit, and here we get to see those additional 13 permissions plus full control being the 14th, like I mentioned earlier. Now remember, we wanted our user, XP user in this case, to be able to write extended attributes. So under our allow column, we'll come down here and we'll check write extended attributes. Now up the top here you'll note that these permissions will apply to this folder, any subfolders, and of course all files in the hierarchy of this folder and subfolders. Now if you don't want this to apply for any subfolders, we could simply select this folder only. We could choose this folder and its files. Of course we could also choose files only. We've got a different array of options here. Alright, well we'll click on OK, and then we'll click on OK again. Now if we scroll down a little bit, you'll notice that XP user 1's account now has a tick in the special permissions box. And you might also note that it's greyed out, so we can't actually make any changes here. So if we need to make any changes to XP user 1's special permissions, we need to go back and click on the advanced button and then edit those changes here. So this little grey box gives us a visual cue that XP user 1's permissions have been customized. Now let's move on and we'll talk about inherited permissions. Now inherited permissions were first introduced in Windows 2000 and of course are here in Windows 2003. Now inheritance, simply put, means that a folder uses the permissions of its parent. In essence, the folder with inherited permissions really has no permissions of its own. Everything has been assigned at a higher level. So to illustrate how this works, I'm going to right click on the desktop and I'm going to choose New Folder. And I'm going to give this the name of number 1. And now I'll share this folder out by right clicking, selecting Sharing and Security. I'll choose to share this folder. And I'm just going to leave all the default permissions. Now again, I'm going to right click on our shared folder and select Properties. And I'm going to come up here to the Security tab. And now I'm going to add in our XP User 1 account. And I'll click OK, OK, OK again. Now I'll open up our number 1 folder and I'll right click, select New Folder. I'm going to call this one number 2. Okay, now we'll go and right click on our number 2 folder and we'll select Properties. Now we'll come over here and select the Security tab, and here we can see XP User 1 does have permissions on this folder, and we can see that he has Read and Execute, List Folder Contents and Read, but you notice that they're all greyed out. Now this is inheritance at work. This folder has inherited its permissions from its parent folder, which of course is folder 1. So if we'll go back and we'll right click on our folder 1 and we'll select Properties, we'll come to our Security tab. And again we'll select our XP User 1 account, and here we can see the exact same permissions, although these aren't greyed out, and we can certainly edit these if we like. Now the simple fact that we have a black check on a white background here and not a grey background identifies the root of where the permissions were assigned, so I know that I don't have to go back up the folder structure to find out if permissions were set at a higher level, because I know this is where they were set. Okay, so let's go back to our folder 2, and I'm going to right click again, select Properties, and come back to my Security tab, and this time we'll take a look at our administrator account. Now if we go down to our permissions, we can see that this is all greyed out as well. So this must mean our permissions have been set at a higher level. Okay, well what we'll do is we'll cancel this, we'll go back to our folder 1, we'll right click, we'll select Properties, go to our Sharing tab, and this is also greyed out. But this is where our share starts, so what's going on? Well actually we still have one more level in this case, the root drive itself. So if we open up My Computer, we'll right click on the drive itself and select Properties, and then come over here to our Security tab. Now for our administrators group, we can now see that our permissions are selectable. Now by default, certain groups are assigned default permissions, and in the absence of us configuring permissions, these are inherited when we create subfolders. Now while we're here in the permissions of our root drive, what we'll do is we'll click on Advanced because I want to show you something else. Under our Inherited From column, you can see here that none of our permissions have been inherited, which is logical considering that we can't go any higher than the root of the disk. Now the next thing I want to point out is this checkbox below. Replace permission entries on all child objects with entries shown here that apply to child objects. Now that's a bit of a mouthful, that one, but what it means is if we make a change to the users and groups permissions here at the root level, we can force all of our child objects below, such as our files and folders and any new folders that are created, to inherit these permissions here. So if we go and click on Add, Advanced, Find Now, and we'll scroll down and we'll select our XP User 1 account, we'll select OK, and then OK again. And what we'll do is we'll give XP User 1 full control. Then we'll click on OK, and now we'll choose this box here. Now in net effect of what we've done is we've given XP User 1 full control of the root of our drive. Now doing what I've just described here is not good practice, so I'm not going to do it, but it's important to understand what this checkbox here will do. Okay, so I'm going to cancel out of this now, and we'll go back to our folder 1, we'll right click and we'll select Properties, and we'll come back and select the Security tab. Now we'll come down here and we'll choose Advanced, and we can see exactly the same sort of screen we saw a moment ago. But this time we see here we have a parent and a child checkbox. Now the child checkbox is exactly the same as the one we saw a moment ago, except that we can control permissions from this point onwards using this button at this level. So in other words, any subfolders that we have within this folder will be affected by us placing a check in this box. Now the other box is to allow inheritable permissions from the parent to propagate to this object and all of our child objects. Now you'll notice that this is checked by default, and this is what enables all of our permissions from the root drive to be able to be propagated down to this folder and any subfolders. So if we don't want this to occur, we can simply uncheck this box. But a word of warning though, if you do uncheck this box and then proceed with the changes, then every user and group, with the exception of the local administrator, will be removed from the permissions, and it'll result in their access being denied. Now, before we wrap up this discussion of inheritance, I want to make mention of inheriting a deny permission. Now, as we've mentioned earlier, a deny overrides all allow permissions. Well, that's true except in one case, where an explicit allow has been granted on a child object. So let's say that our XP user 1 has been denied access to folder 1. So we've blocked everything for our poor old XP user 1. Now permissions are inherited on folder 2 from folder 1. So again, XP user has no access to folder 2 either. But inside folder 2, we place a file. Now by default, XP user 1 won't be able to access that file either. But on this file, if we go into the security properties and click the advanced button, and then add the read permission to XP user 1's account, the result will be that XP user 1 can in fact read that file. So that's what happens when deny permissions have been inherited. An explicit allow will still grant a user access even though a deny permission is present. In all other cases though, a deny permission will win out. Now the next thing I want to talk about is effective permissions. Now even once you start becoming familiar with share and NTFS permissions, it can be quite confusing to identify who has what permissions when you're dealing with files and folders that are nested deeply inside other folders. Now this is where the new effective permissions tab comes into play. This tab, which is new in Windows 2003, takes the guesswork out of determining the permissions of a user or group. So to determine the effective permissions of a user or group, we'll simply come over here and choose the select button, and then we'll browse for our user or group. So we'll choose advanced, find now, and we'll scroll down and we'll choose our XP user 1 user. We'll click OK, and then OK again. Now at this point here, we will see the effective permissions that our XP user 1 has to this object. Now there are some limitations to this tool though. Firstly, it does not take into account any share permissions, and it cannot calculate effective permissions for the domain users group, as it doesn't calculate permissions for domain groups that are nested inside local groups, as is the case with the domain users group being nested inside the local users group. And finally, it doesn't take into account the multiple security IDs that accounts may have. For example, users logged in using a terminal services security ID cannot be calculated properly with this tool. But don't think that because of these limitations that this tool is not useful. In fact, quite the opposite. For the vast majority of tasks, you'll find yourself quite happy with the results that this tool produces. Now before we move on, let's take a look at another tab on this dialog box, which is the Owner tab. Now it's inevitable at some stage in your career you will come across a problem where no one, including an administrator, can access a file. And this problem can occur when you remove the Everyone group from the Access Control list on the Security tab of the File Properties. Now what happens is you need to have permissions to be able to assign permissions. Now fortunately we have this thing called ownership. Now the owner of an object by default is the creator of the object, and that person has the ability to assign permissions. So to demonstrate this, I've gone and removed access for folder 2 for everyone except for XP user 1 who has full control. So as the administrator, if I double click, you'll notice that access is denied. So I'll go and right click on our folder 2 and select properties. And then I'll come over here to the security tab. Now you'll notice that XP user 1 is the only user that actually has permissions on our folder. Now because I'm the administrator, if we go to the advanced button, and when we go to our Owners tab, we can see that the current owner of this item is the administrator. So this means that I still do have some fallback permissions. So I'm going to click Cancel here, and I'm going to come over here and click Add, Advanced, and Find Now, and I'm going to add our administrator account back in, and click OK, OK, and then OK again. Now if I go and try and access this folder, I can actually get in. But in the meantime, XP user 1 has gone and created a text file. So if I double click on that, again I get access denied. So I've got a bit of a problem. So now if I right click on this file and select Properties and then the Security tab, you'll notice here that I get a different message. I don't have permission to view or edit it, but I can take ownership or change any auditing settings. So I'm going to click on OK, click on Advanced, I go back to my Owners tab. We can see here that we're currently unable to display who the current owner is, but I can change the owner to myself as the administrator. So what I'll do is I'll select the administrator and then click Apply, and now we just get a message that says we've just taken ownership, but we will need to close and reopen it. So we'll click on OK, OK, OK again, and now we can simply right click on our file, select Properties, go back to our Security tab, and at this point now I can go back in and add our administrator account. And I'll give myself full control, and now I have complete access back to the file. So you can see that taking ownership of a file or folder is a relatively easy thing to do. Sometimes we don't know who the current owner is, such as in the case we just saw, but we don't really care either. All that matters is that we're able to fix the problem as we've just demonstrated. So there you have Windows 2003 Share and NTFS Permissions. It's important to get your head around the concept of permissions, as they can make or break your day if you don't get them right. Get them wrong and you'll have little or no security at all, or users that just plain dislike you because they can't access what they're supposed to be able to access. So spend some time understanding how permissions will affect access to the objects in your network, and remember, wherever possible, place users in groups and then assign permissions to the group, and this will make managing your share and NTFS permissions much easier.